Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing the last bonus episode of our 2023 Tea Technique research trip. In this episode, we're discussing our time in Yunnan, predominantly southern Yunnan, across Puer and Sichuanbana. Joining me here today is Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongzun Li.
Hello.
As I said, this is the last of our bonus episodes. In the previous two bonus episodes, we first talked about our time in Yixing. We then talked about our time in Chaozhou. And finally, we're talking about the last leg of our trip to Yunnan. Pat Penny will be moderating this discussion because, unfortunately, he didn't join Zongjun and I on this leg of the trip.
FOMO was real. So I was seeing you guys. You were sending pictures. It looked amazing. Yunnan has always been on my dream list of tea places to go, along with Wuyi, which, hopefully will come true sometime in the next short few years. So I've got a lot of questions for you guys. First up, I think just for the audience, where did you guys go? Yunnan is huge. So what locations did you hit up?
We end up hitting a few locations magically somehow that it all aligned with our trip route. So we ended up hiring a driver. We landed in Puer City. Well, we first landed in Kunming and we stayed there for like a night for shakao and beer, of course. Jason had to convince me that Yunnan shakao is the best shakao in China, and I'm fairly convinced at this point. Although we need to one day sample Xi'an shakao just for comparison. But that was a great night, and next day we flew to Puer, and we end up meeting some friends in Puer, and then we hop on a car to Jingmai. Spent a few nights at Jingmai, and then we passed our wonderful route through Menghai, and then we ended in Yiwu.
Ooh, what a trek. So I heard some of the back and forth as you guys were kind of planning when to go and where, and it made the beginning of our trip sound really easy in comparison. Can you guys just talk a little bit about how is it getting around Yunnan, particularly maybe Jason from your perspective, because Zongjun at least can speak the language and can buy things on Ctrip.
And Jason, you've been to Yunnan a couple of years ago, so
yeah. So Yunnan is certainly more difficult to travel in than coastal China. But that said, once you find and hire a trustable driver, it was shockingly easy. Like that, it was a total non-issue. If Zongjun and I had attempted to do this trip using public transportation or the non-public, the private microbus variations, it would have been a whole lot more difficult and taken a lot more time. Yunnan, compared to when I was first there in 2007 and 2009, it was a world of difference. Landing in Kunming, the city was just unrecognizable. It had expanded. Not so much in population, according to the official statistics, but industrialization and development. The airport was unbelievably huge. That airport wasn't there when I was there 14 years ago. The city was full of high rises, and I didn't really recognize a lot of the city until Zongjun and I, walking around after not enough Shaokao skewers and a few too many beers, stumbled onto the tea market. And the tea market was identical. I was able to walk in and say, that's where I used to hang out. This is the second floor storefront where I first learning about puer tea. And that was a real memory hole that brought some of the city and some of the locations back to me. But, in those previous times, I was traveling by the semi-public transportation. I was hiring the Minbaoche buses, negotiating with bus drivers to jump on and off at unofficial drop-off points. And now compared to then, this was a lot easier. But I will say that trip and that route was only possible by luck. That the timing just happened to work, and we just happened to be there in a weird year where the seasons were a little unstable and people were in the fields longer, and it all worked out magically, but certainly not by any quirk of master genius planning. It was a very lucky trip.
I'm pretty sure it was Zongjun's master genius planning. Luck is only 50% of the equation. So lots of locations, lots of places that you guys hit up. Why? Why did you go to so many places? What did you experience or hope to experience there? Did all of your wishes magically come true?
I'll say from my perspective, a lot of it was I almost call this leg of the trip a pre-research trip. It had been so long since I've been, for 14 years, right? And obviously I studied puer, and I know a good amount of puer, but I felt really strongly that I needed to re-see everything. That, 14 years ago, I was still very much a novice. I was just learning about things. And so what I took away and what I was paying attention to at that time was very different than the types of things that I would know and care about now. And so, this was definitely a breadth search. This was take as large of a slice as I can across that region and that area, see as much as I can, and really try to gain a foothold in understanding, what do I need to come back and spend more time studying? What do I need to spend a longer time to see and look at? And I think it was quite successful in that this was very much an intensive crash course.
I feel very much the same way as Jason. Puer, to me, is probably a very different thing compared to what you guys feel about puer. I grew up drinking puer. It's a regular beverage for Yamcha in Canton area. And that's what my, first exposure to the flavor of puer. And it was really until I met you guys in the States that I started drinking more puer and learn about, things or flavors about puer. But I was never really have a deep understanding or know about a history behind puer, except for the general knowledge until this trip. I really was able to, dive into a selection of different regions and see the regional variations and actually talk to the farmers, the tea makers, and start to get a real grasp of not what I want to know, but what I don't know and I want to know in the future.
So I do want to dig a little deeper on that, but first, just finishing out the foundation of the conversation. I think we got a little bit from Jason of maybe was different from the last time you were there, but Zongjun, I do want to hear, since this is, you live close to, relatively speaking, Yunnan, Canton, very relatively speaking, but this was your first time, right, in Yunnan?
Actually, my second time too.
Second time, okay.
My first time was like when I was, I don't know, 7 or 8.
Gotcha. So there still had to have been some things.
Also 14 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. You guys were there at the same time. You totally just missed each other. It was this beautiful stars aligning, crossing fates moment. Zongjun, was there something that surprised you though? When you were there this time?
I really don't have much memory about Yunnan other than the big mountains, and I have a very vivid memory of a bunch of people feeding us powder ant. Like they grind dry ants into powder and put them into some kind of herbal beverage and served it to us. It was, I would say, very much a culture shock for me as a kid. But also Jason front-loaded me with a lot of stories that he experienced, 14 years ago. So my expectation was well managed or well mismanaged before I landed in Yunnan. So, the trip surprised me by a lot of things, not just the vast knowledge or information about puer tea, within the local community, but also how much Yunnan has changed from my memory and also Jason's memory.
So I think the beginning trip, the Yixing part of the trip, the Chaozhou part of the trip, I felt like I was learning so much. I don't know how you guys managed to learn any more, but I do want to hear a lot, probably in more detail than we can cover on this podcast, about what you learned. And so if we can just maybe pick the top thing that you really just felt like you didn't know before visiting Yunnan that now you feel confident about. And if there was something that you learned that you were really excited that confirmed an understanding you had, if you could share kind of those two bits of knowledge that came out of this trip, what would those be?
I think I have 1.5. The thing that most surprised me was how much the regulatory environment has shaped the processing and the production of puer. And that almost feels like a weird thing to say, but there's been so much changing regulation amongst both the national government and the local governments in the food safety regulations around where and how puer is processed, that it has truly transformed the industry from, pick, sun wither, lay it out and press it into cakes, into a much more controlled process that requires some specialized production facilities and licensed facilities. And this is true for sheng puer. It's doubly true for shou puer, which at this point is really only done in very well-regulated, highly specific spots. But it's really, in some ways, it's distanced the traditional methodologies and techniques from the various local villages and individual families that have been doing this before. And then in other ways, the families have continued to find ways of reintroducing traditional techniques back into the processing. And when you think about the factory cakes versus the individual boutique, small single origin producers, within the small single origin producers, there's a similar split. There's what are basically family level productions, some of which are even unlicensed family production that are taking regulatory risks with their productions versus the family factories. And so much of that regulatory environment wasn't there at all when I was first there in 2007. And this was right at the start and the bursting of the puer bubble, and everyone was still exuberant about it. And puer was being hailed as a unique, traditional, ancient Southern Yunnan cultural artifact. So, a lot of hyper real bundled into that. And then I knew that the regulatory environment had continued to change as there was fraudulent puer and some unsafe practices in the production of show puer. And Professor Zhang Jinghong, wrote a lot about the introduction of the QS regulations in her most amazing book. But I didn't realize how much it had continued to change and evolve since there, right? I was still very much in the mindset, okay, what are, the QS regulations? QS regulations aren't even there anymore. They've been totally disbanded. So that's the thing that I found most surprising is, in other tea areas, you don't really interact with or think much about the regulatory environment. It's much more like dealing with alcohol in the United States than it is dealing with tea in other areas. But I guess partially because of the fermentation process, particularly in show, and partially because of the history of fraudulent activity in puer production, the regulatory environment has made a really big impact.
Yeah, I just want to echo with the last point of Jason. Right now, it's all SEZheng. It's the certificate for cake production and cake compression. So a handful of local factories, usually medium to larger size factories, have the qualification to get or apply for that certificate. It's a very interesting centralization of production from, more decentralized boutique or family-run tea labels or tea production to essentially everything needs to be compressed into a cake at a designated venue with that certificate. So I don't know if it's a bad thing or a good thing for the long run, but it's definitely very interesting to observe.
So I wanted to follow up with you guys on, what was something that you learned that was confirmatory and positive learning you took away. But before we get to that, I do want to just follow that thread of how do you think this centralization has affected or will affect puer as we move into the future?
I think that the regulations will continue to evolve. Regulation in China is less command and control than they would have you believe. It's much more of a give and take and a negotiation at the local level. The laws are strict as they're written and then negotiated in interpretation at the actual levels of production. And so, despite whatever the actual text of the regulation is, like I said, a lot of the families are still able to bring traditional processing techniques back into it, particularly for the very expensive boutique productions, the very high-end boutique productions. In this research trip, we did not attempt to go to some of the individual village, individual minority group productions, right? We didn't go to see like bamboo leaf wrapped puer, bamboo tubes stuffed and roast puer. Some of that stuff is happening almost entirely outside of the regulatory regime. So we know that the regulations are not 100% at removing traditional production techniques. So I would say the future of puer is really a future of one of the more rapidly evolving tea processing techniques and tea types, right? Real puer like we think of it, we talk about proto-puer in the 1900s, but puer as its tastes today, as it exists today, we used to lecture about this in the Institute, is one of the most recent classes of tea, really from the 1920s, and only really hitting a stride in a unique and identifiable flavor into the 60s or so. So the history is less old than a lot of people would have you believe for the contemporary flavor. And there is a technique, there's traditions that date back much further, but I think it's going to continue to evolve. One of the things that was confirmatory-ish, but very, very, very interesting, is when I was first there, right, 2007, 2009, most of the local people really didn't drink aged tea. You went to Yunnan and you got the fresh tea, and then if you were interested in aging, you brought it back and you aged it yourself. And it was a mix of Taiwanese and Cantonese people really that came in to purchase the tea for aging. There was some levels of tea traditions in Korea that had a appreciation of puer that predates the revolutionary period, or the CNNP period. And this time, returning to Yunnan, everyone was interested in aged puer. All of the top tea producers and people had a library of their own tea, or maybe some other people's teas, going far back and talking about the way that the tea is aged and changed over time. And that's very different. When you think about who's making the tea and what they expect people to do with the tea, people who are drinking the tea super fresh, entirely green, right, within a year or two after harvest, but selling it to people who are planning on aging it, versus the second generation of makers, right? We're talking about going already in those 14 years from father to son. The children of that first generation post-factory period are now tasting aged tea and enjoy aged puer tea and are purposely making their tea suitable for aging. And so I think that puer as a tradition, puer as a technique, puer as a industry is going to continue to improve and evolve. And I think it's one of the more dynamic classes of tea in that way.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And also from what we've been seeing, particularly in some of the tea makers that we talked to in Yiwu region, they actually take a very innovative and dynamic approach to tea processing. Like, they stay true to their traditional method, but they're also constantly seeking on improvements. So one of the pretty memorable comments that we heard from one of our tea friends in Yiwu is that what's tradition doesn't necessarily mean it's good. If something gets improved, then we should stay with the improvement instead of criticizing it being new. That's something that I found very inspiring.
Very nice. As you guys talk more and more, I'm just feeling what I missed out on. Hoping I can keep hearing more past this podcast and learning more from you guys about what you experienced. Speaking to that, it's been a few weeks since you got back. Hopefully your memories are all kind of synthesized and everything is locked in place as you've gotten a few good night's sleeps. Can you guys paint kind of a picture for me and our audience of one of your favorite memories from the trip? So if you can really just put us into a place, it doesn't have to specifically be about tea. It could be about food or anything you experienced. But if there was one experience you really wanted to convey to everyone who's listening, what would that be?
I would start with a non-tea related one. Our super long car ride from Jingmai all the way to Yiwu, passing by Menghai. It was such an interesting trip. It's really long. We took about an entirety of 5 to 6 hours, I think, from Jingmai to all the way to Yiwu. And just seeing how the landscape changes and how the local, the style of building changes, and the villages, how people farm, what kind of agriculture do they farm. It's like the epitome of the diversity of Yunnan. Like, Yunnan is definitely the most diverse place I've ever visited in China. There's so many different minorities, ethnicities, regional cultures. And that route was just very eye-opening for me. And also we tried to open the window, smell the aroma from different mountains, try to discern what kind of flavors they are, and, sing different weird songs that Jason and I can think of to echo with our experience. It was amazing.
Just piggybacking on Zongjun's comment, I insist on driving with the windows open. I need to feel the temperature differences and the smell of the wind. And I think a few times I drove Zongjun a little bit crazy, jumping in the car like 5:30, 6 a.m., like windows totally down, cold mountain air blowing. But
giant hornets flying in. Yeah.
I'm glad now, like, it was type B fun. Like, he slept on it. It's a few weeks after the experience, and he's like, that was wonderful.
Yeah,
that was his memory. That's his number one memory right there.
First time we were trying to do so, we were right behind a giant truck, and Jason was trying to convince me to take a breath of the mountain smell.
Wow, Nen will really smell.
When I was about to open the window, the truck blowed a giant breeze of dust.
Now you know where all the petrol
That was-
notes are coming from.
that was amazing. Zongjun's like fine, rolls down his window and just gets a face full of dust. It was just it was poorly timed.
Not that any of our lungs were in good condition from this trip anyway. They were already blackened by smoke.
Yeah, that one is extra potent.
I'd say on very close to one of the last day of our time in Yunnan, the last evening, we were invited to a friend in Yiwu's a tea maker's tea room, and he had some other individuals who were treating him as a teacher who he was treating as students. And so these were actually a group of local tobacco farmers, young people in their mid-20s to early 30s who were tobacco farmers who decided that they were going to get out of the tobacco business and start planting tea. And it was really interesting to be around young people who were about to enter a tea farming world. And because of that, they were going to be making new plantings. The lesson that evening into night was actually on small trees. And we were tasting a variety of different small tree tea of different qualities with different flaws. And we were talking about how those flaws could be mitigated with blending, or how the trees are treated, and fertilization levels and temperature levels. And it was so different than all of the prior work and tasting that we've been doing. We're like, okay, this is old tree teas. These trees are at least 200 years old. They're from deep forest, mountain streams, first pick harvest, and then we're going, and then we're with these people who are about to become tea farmers, who are about to be planting and taking cuttings, props from other trees to plant their own, saying like, this is what you can do. This is what you can do right now. This is the type of tea that you can make right now. And these are the gradations in the quality levels. And that was such a strange and interesting, it wasn't a question that I even knew to ask. And these guys and one woman had some tattoos and some piercings, and they looked quite a bit rougher. And then they were like ridiculously polite and very soft spoken, which also feels very, very Yunnan, with the tattoos and some piercings and much edgier look than you generally see in China, and then just being.
Yeah, it sounds like the look of, the early years of the Tea Institute.
You feel some affinity there, Pat.
Yeah, most of our members right there. I came into the Tea Institute with 6 or 7 piercings.
And
don't have any of them now.
Laid propeller hat.
Oh, don't forget about my tattoo either. So that sounds like amazing. As you said, right, we always focus on kind of the top end, right? We've always been looking for, this is what the taste of old trees, rare areas are. So we're never really thinking to look or dig deeper into the distinctions of younger trees or less desired from a Western consumer standpoint, puer areas or trees or types. So that's definitely an interesting area of learning. And please put together your notes so that I can read all of that. We're going to want to start wrapping it up. There's so much more it sounds like you guys have to say, but I think we want to keep people on the edge of their seat here. So, Jason, you mentioned earlier that this was a trip of breadth, right? You were trying to really widen the net and see what you could capture to reseed future experiences. When you go back, what do you guys plan to do differently?
I would spend more time in Yiwu, certainly, and I'd get much deeper into Yiwu. We spent a lot of time in Mahe and Gaoshan, but getting all the way out to like Guofengjai, for example, would be a 2 to 3 day trip to actually go there, stay there, walk into the tea forests. I think that there's a lot of interesting and good and overlooked tea that are on the outskirts or right on the ribbon outside of Yiwu proper. That's very minority group tea. That would also be very interesting to see. And then I would love to see some traditional but non-standard processing, the bamboo stuff, the bamboo wrapped leaf, some of the village made tea. I think that would be very interesting. I don't know if I would wind up purchasing or enjoying or proclaiming the greatness of a lot of it, but I think that it's an important component in the history and the culture of Yunnan.
I would certainly be more interested in doing village hopping to a lot of these production regions. Our favorite place like Wangong and some of the more legendary places like Chawangshu and Bohetang, and a lot of these places that some of them I previously unheard of. Would be super interesting to just, venture into them. One of our friends who we met when we passed by Menghai told us that some of these places take quite a bit of effort to get in. So that might require some more preparation in advance.
They might not be super, super welcoming.
Keep people out, just making sure the tea doesn't get supplied too far and wide, or?
No, it's more about the environment, like raining down leeches from the treetop would be something that we need to consider.
Snakes, hornets, yeah.
We saw a poisonous snake crossing the road, just going straight across. Those things move a lot faster than their legless bodies would have you believe.
No, thank you.
And all sorts of weird insects.
You guys met with a lot of vendors, but as we were in Yixing and as we were in Chaozhou and as we've traveled in the past decade, we know that the Western-facing vendor prices are very different than what is set in the market. What was your experience of that in Yunnan? Were you guys dealing directly with farmers and purchasing anything from farmers? What did you experience? Was there any price shock?
I mean, prices for top-level puer are still expensive, and they're expensive by Chinese standards. There's certainly a Western-facing vendor premium, but on the other hand, I place a lot of value in curation and being able to purchase semi-blind or being able to taste samples before major purchases. So I think the price shock was more real in Yixing than it is in Yunnan.
Yeah, I would say so. It's quite obvious to see how much of a reduction of puer prices in general compared to the puer bubble in the last decade. For people that we have met, they have been quite generous to have us, taking samples and experiencing different tea sessions with them for different, either a vertical tasting of years or vertical tasting of regions. So I was quite surprised about the general hospitality that we have received in Yunnan.
Nice. Okay, let's get to food.
2 words: mountain rice. Mountain rice, purple mountain rice, purple streaks mountain rice is just amazing. It is a very grainy tasting, almost like barley tasting rice. It's much firmer. It's not available commercially. It's just something that's farmed in villages and traded amongst villagers. It was interesting, the minority groups, the minority ethnicities in Yunnan all eat the mountain rice. The Han people generally do not eat the mountain rice, but we have some minor evidence they could if they wanted to. Zongjun liked it.
I do. I like firm rice.
Mountain rice really stood out to me.
I feel like that all the mountain products are just really delicious, at least to me, like mountain chicken and all the mountain greens. And they are all being prepped into a method that it's not so common in coastal regions. So a lot like, northern Thai food for my own experience.
Or Laos, a lot of Laotian.
Yeah, Laotian cuisine. So a lot of these stir-fried or salad with very thin tofu skins being blended together with the fermented vinegars or whatever marinated juice that they prepped for. It's quite delicious.
Anything you didn't like? I know Jason's a super adventurous eater, so I don't think there's much he wouldn't try. Was there anything either of you guys either declined to try or did not enjoy?
We ate the moldy tofu a few times. Smelly tofu, cho tofu, particularly Kunming style cho tofu, I'm totally fine with. The moldy tofu was pushing it a little bit.
It's like a blend between stinky tofu and blue cheese.
Was it purposely moldy?
Yeah.
Told so.
Okay.
I mean, it looked like a thick layer of blue cheese mold on a piece of cho tofu. They were really trying to amp up the flavor intensity there.
Are you cutting off the mold layer or you're just oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
I might have avoided that one if I was there.
It was not my favorite. There's very few things I can say that for, but
the feeling of fuzzy mold just hitting your teeth, you're not a fan?
You don't quite taste the mold. I mean, they it's more used as some kind of like a spice to dishes.
Yeah, you taste it. You mean you don't feel it.
You just
Yeah, you
you
don't
just
see
dust it on top of everything. It's spice. Okay. Let me keep
Yeah.
some mold in my cabinet for when I want to make some Yunnan cuisine.
Yeah. I would say bitter bamboo is not really my thing.
Oh, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Was it served a lot?
A couple times it came up.
Okay.
Yeah, a few times. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's served in like huge portions, and you just like you get a giant chunk of bitter bamboo, and it is incredibly bitter bamboo.
Different from kugwa, because I know you love kugwa.
I do love kugwa. No, this is much less vegetal and much more of like a woody bitterness, and you just kind of have to gnaw on giant
Right.
piece of bitter bamboo for a while.
Doesn't sound pleasant. So any last things you guys want to say before we close out? My last thing is I'm going with you next time.
I hope so.
Zongjun, any closing words?
Yeah, it's a really fun trip. Really eye-opening trip for me. And I'm super looking forward to go back.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. That's all the time that we have for today. Please join us again for our next conversation as we resume our regularly scheduled programming on Book 2, Yixing Teapots.